The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace sparkled under crystal chandeliers as Britain's elite gathered for the annual Royal Charitable Foundation Gala. Diamonds caught the light from every corner of the room, while silk gowns rustled against polished marble floors. The evening promised to raise millions for children's hospitals across the Commonwealth. But tonight would be remembered for entirely different reasons. Charles stood near the entrance, greeting guests with practiced royal charm. His navy dress uniform displayed decades of military decorations, each medal telling stories of service and duty. At 75, he had mastered the art of royal presence, knowing exactly when to smile, when to listen, and when to move conversations along with diplomatic grace. Tonight felt different, though. Something stirred in the air that made him unusually alert. The guest list read like a directory of power and influence. Cabinet ministers mingled with tech billionaires, while Olympic champions shared champagne with Academy Award winners. Foreign diplomats spoke in hushed tones about trade agreements, while fashion designers discussed their latest collections. The monarchy's soft power filled every conversation, weaving Britain's cultural influence through the room like an invisible thread. William and Catherine arrived fashionably late, drawing admiring glances as they worked the room. Catherine wore a stunning emerald gown that complemented her sapphire engagement ring, Diana's ring, which never failed to remind Charles of his first wife's enduring legacy. The couple moved with natural confidence, Catherine's easy laugh mixing with William's deeper voice as they chatted with tech entrepreneurs about digital literacy programs for underprivileged youth. "Your Majesty, the Qatari ambassador has arrived," whispered Charles's private secretary, appearing at his elbow with practiced discretion. These events required constant choreography, every introduction planned to maximize diplomatic benefit while maintaining the evening's social atmosphere. Charles nodded, preparing to greet another important guest when movement caught his eye. Camilla appeared at the top of the grand staircase, and time seemed to slow. Her royal blue gown flowed elegantly as she descended, designed by one of Britain's most celebrated fashion houses. The color brought out her eyes while the cut flattered her figure. She moved with the confidence that came from decades in the public eye, no longer the nervous woman who once hid from cameras. But something glittered at her throat that made Charles's breath catch. The necklace was unmistakable. 3 strands of perfectly matched pearls with a sapphire clasp that caught the light like captured starlight. Charles had commissioned that piece 37 years ago from Gerard, the crown jewelers, as a wedding gift for Diana. He remembered every detail of choosing those pearls, selecting each one personally to ensure perfect color and luster. The sapphire clasp featured stones from the same mine that had produced Diana's engagement ring. The jewelry had special significance beyond its monetary value. Diana had worn it to their first state dinner as a married couple, to William's christening, and to countless other significant moments in their life together. After Diana's death, Charles had carefully placed the necklace in the royal collection, assuming it would eventually pass to Catherine as William's wife. The sapphires matched her engagement ring perfectly, making it a natural inheritance for the future queen. But there was Camilla, wearing Diana's necklace as if it belonged to her. The pearls caught the ballroom's light exactly as they had when Diana wore them to the Nobel Prize ceremony in 1995. Charles remembered photographing Diana that night, the necklace creating an elegant frame for her radiant smile. Now those same pearls adorned his second wife, creating an impossible bridge between past and present. Charles forced his expression to remain neutral as Camilla approached. Royal training had taught him to control his reactions, but inside his mind raced through possibilities. Had there been some mistake in the jewelry storage? Had Camilla simply chosen the necklace without realizing its history? Or was this something more deliberate, a statement he wasn't prepared to interpret? "Charles, darling, you look wonderfully handsome in your uniform," Camilla said, reaching up to straighten his already perfect tie. Her fingers brushed the medals on his chest, each one representing years of service and sacrifice. The gesture appeared intimate and caring to observers, but Charles noticed the slight tremor in her hands. She was nervous about something. "You look beautiful," Charles replied automatically, his eyes drawn once again to the necklace. Up close, he could see the tiny imperfections in the pearls that made them genuine, the way the sapphire clasp caught light at precisely the angle he remembered. This was definitely Diana's necklace, not some similar piece from the royal collection. The question was whether Camilla understood the significance of what she was wearing. "Thank you for choosing such a lovely piece," Charles said carefully, testing the waters. His voice carried decades of diplomatic training, revealing nothing while potentially learning everything. In royal circles, words carried multiple meanings, and tonight felt like navigating a particularly complex conversation. Camilla's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, fingers touching the pearls with something approaching reverence. "It's quite beautiful, isn't it? I thought it would be perfect for tonight's occasion." Her words sounded rehearsed, as if she had practiced this exact response. But her eyes held something Charles couldn't quite identify. Defiance? Fear? Determination? Before Charles could respond, the Lord Chamberlain announced the arrival of the Prime Minister and his wife. Royal protocol demanded Charles's immediate attention, but his mind remained fixed on the necklace around Camilla's throat. The evening stretched ahead with hundreds of conversations to navigate, toasts to make, and diplomatic objectives to achieve. But now every interaction would be colored by the 3 strands of pearls that connected his past to his present in ways he had never anticipated. The orchestra began playing softly as guests settled into their assigned tables. Charles and Camilla would sit at the high table, elevated slightly above the rest of the ballroom where everyone could see them. Tonight, everyone would see Diana's necklace worn by Diana's successor, whether they recognized it or not. The weight of that symbolism settled on Charles's shoulders like another military decoration, one that came with responsibilities he wasn't sure he understood. As they moved through the crowd toward their table, Charles caught sight of William, and Catherine engaged in animated conversation with several young entrepreneurs. Catherine's hand rested casually on William's arm while she listened intently to a young woman describing her charity's work with refugee children. The sapphires in Catherine's engagement ring caught the light, and Charles realized how perfectly Diana's necklace would have complemented that ring, how natural the inheritance should have been. But Camilla wore the necklace now, and every pearl seemed to carry weight beyond its physical presence. The evening had just begun, but Charles already felt the current pulling them toward conversations that would reshape everything they thought they understood about family, legacy, and the careful balance of royal relationships. The first course was announced, and guests began taking their seats. Charles offered Camilla his arm, feeling the familiar weight of her hand against his sleeve. But tonight, every gesture felt different, charged with the symbolism of the jewelry at her throat. As they walked toward the high table, Charles wondered if anyone else in the room recognized Diana's necklace, and what they might think about seeing it worn by a second wife. The evening stretched ahead with all its planned speeches, charity presentations, and diplomatic conversations. But Charles knew that underneath it all, 3 strands of pearls would dominate his thoughts, carrying questions about intention, respect, and the complex mathematics of love and memory that defined royal life. The necklace connected past to present in ways that protocol books never addressed, creating a situation that would require navigation through uncharted emotional territory. Camilla squeezed his arm gently as they reached their seats, and Charles looked down in her eyes, searching for answers to questions he couldn't yet voice. The orchestra played on, the chandeliers sparkled overhead, and hundreds of guests continued their conversations, unaware that the evening's most significant drama was just beginning to unfold around 3 strands of perfectly matched pearls and the memories they carried. The first course arrived with military precision, Scottish salmon arranged artfully on bone china plates bearing the royal cipher. Charles picked at his food while his mind churned through decades of memories triggered by the necklace at Camilla's throat. She chatted easily with the Archbishop of Canterbury seated to her left, discussing recent cathedral restoration projects with genuine enthusiasm. To any observer, she appeared completely at ease, but Charles noticed subtle signs of tension in the way she occasionally touched the pearls. "Your Majesty, might I ask about the jewelry preservation program at the Royal Collection?" asked Lady Morrison, a prominent art historian seated across from them. "I understand there are fascinating stories behind many pieces." Charles nearly choked on his wine. The question seemed innocent enough, but the timing felt loaded with significance. He glanced at Camilla, who continued her conversation with the Archbishop while her fingers unconsciously traced the sapphire clasp. Did she realize how many people in this room would recognize Diana's most photographed necklace? "The collection holds centuries of history," Charles replied diplomatically. "Each piece carries stories of the individuals who wore them and the occasions they marked. Some jewelry becomes so associated with particular moments that it transcends mere decoration to become historical artifact." Lady Morrison nodded enthusiastically. "Rather like that stunning pearl necklace Her Majesty is wearing tonight. The craftsmanship appears exceptional." She leaned forward slightly, studying the piece with an expert's eye. "Those pearls have such beautiful luster. They must have quite a provenance." The conversation paused as if the entire table held its breath. Charles felt Camilla stiffen beside him, her hand moving to rest protectively over the necklace. The Archbishop continued discussing Gothic architecture, apparently unaware of the tension developing around the jewelry discussion. Other guests pretended absorption in their salmon while actually listening intently to every word. "Many pieces in the collection have interesting histories," Camilla said carefully, her voice steady despite the flush creeping up her neck. "Tonight seemed like a perfect occasion for something special." The words sounded reasonable, but Charles detected an undercurrent of something: defensiveness, justification, challenge. Before Lady Morrison could pursue the topic further, the Master of Ceremonies approached their table with discreet urgency. Charles recognized the man's expression. Something required immediate royal attention. The interruption provided welcome relief from the jewelry discussion, but Charles knew this conversation was far from over. Too many people had now noticed the necklace for the evening to proceed without further comment. "Your Majesty, the Saudi delegation has arrived and requests a private word before the main speeches," the master whispered. Charles nodded, grateful for diplomatic obligations that would remove him temporarily from the increasingly uncomfortable dinner conversation. But as he rose from his seat, he caught sight of movement at William and Catherine's table that made his blood run cold. Catherine was staring directly at Camilla's necklace with an expression of shocked recognition. Her face had gone pale, and her hand gripped William's arm with obvious urgency. William followed his wife's gaze, and Charles watched his son's features transform from polite interest to confused disbelief. The future king was now staring at his stepmother, wearing his deceased mother's most precious jewelry, and his expression suggested this was the first time he had seen the necklace since Diana's death. The realization hit Charles like a physical blow. William and Catherine had no advance warning about the necklace. Whatever Camilla's reasons for choosing Diana's jewelry tonight, she hadn't consulted the people most affected by that choice. Charles found himself caught between his wife and his son, with no protocol to guide him through such personal, treacherous territory. "Charles!" Camilla's voice brought his attention back to their table. "The Saudi delegation?" "Of course," Charles murmured, forcing himself to focus on immediate diplomatic duties while his peripheral vision tracked William's increasingly agitated conversation with Catherine. The young couple appeared to be having an intense discussion disguised as casual dinner chat, with Catherine's hands gesturing subtly toward Camilla's table while William's jaw tightened with barely controlled emotion. Charles excused himself and moved toward the Saudi delegation, but his diplomatic autopilot engaged while his mind remained fixed on the unfolding family drama. The ambassador expressed concerns about trade relationships, proposed cultural exchange programs, and requested royal patronage for a new hospital in Riyadh. Charles responded with appropriate enthusiasm while calculating how to manage the situation developing behind him. Through decades of royal training, Charles had learned to compartmentalize personal concerns during public events. But tonight felt different. The necklace represented more than jewelry. It symbolized legacy, respect, memory, and the delicate balance of blended family relationships under public scrutiny. Every choice carried weight beyond its immediate impact, especially when that choice involved Diana's most recognizable possessions. The Saudi meeting concluded with promises of follow-up discussions and mutual expressions of friendship. Charles turned back toward the ballroom to find the situation had escalated during his absence. Catherine had excused herself from dinner, ostensibly to powder her nose, but Charles recognized the tight control in her posture that suggested barely contained emotion. William sat alone at his table, staring across the room at Camilla with an expression Charles had rarely seen on his son's face. A mixture of hurt, confusion, and something approaching anger. Charles moved through the crowd with practiced royal ease, stopping to exchange pleasantries with various dignitaries while working his way back toward the high table. But each conversation felt surreal, conducted against the background of family tension that threatened to explode into public view. The charity gala continued around them, raising money for children's hospitals while the royal family navigated emotional landmines disguised as dinner conversation. "Your Majesty, wonderful to see you again," called Sir David Attenborough, intercepting Charles near the dance floor. The beloved naturalist's presence provided perfect cover for observation, allowing Charles to assess the situation while appearing engaged in casual conversation. "I understand the Prince and Princess of Wales have been quite supportive of our new wildlife conservation initiative." "Yes, William and Catherine are passionate about environmental protection," Charles replied, using the conversation to study his son's table. William sat rigidly upright, his military posture more pronounced than usual, a sure sign of internal stress. Catherine had not yet returned from her strategic retreat, leaving William to maintain appearances alone while processing whatever emotions Diana's necklace had triggered. Sir David continued discussing conservation programs, but Charles's attention fractured between responding appropriately and monitoring the ballroom's emotional undercurrents. Other guests seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding at the royal tables, focused on their own conversations about business deals, artistic projects, and social connections. But Charles knew that royal watchers among the guests would eventually notice the tension, especially if Catherine remained absent much longer. "The ocean cleanup project has shown remarkable results," Sir David was saying. "Perhaps their Royal Highnesses might consider attending the progress presentation next month." The question required a specific response, forcing Charles back to the immediate conversation despite his divided attention. "I'll discuss it with them," Charles promised, meaning every word while wondering if family relationships would survive tonight's revelations intact enough for joint public appearances. The irony wasn't lost on him. Discussing environmental conservation while his own family ecosystem teetered on the edge of disruption over 3 strands of pearls and their emotional significance. Catherine finally returned to the ballroom, her composure restored but her smile slightly strained around the edges. She moved with characteristic grace, stopping to chat with other guests while working her way back to William's side. But Charles noted the way she avoided looking directly at Camilla's table, suggesting the necklace issue remained very much unresolved in her mind. As Catherine reached William, their reunion appeared warm and natural to casual observers. But Charles recognized the subtle signs of intense private conversation disguised as public affection. The way William leaned close to whisper in Catherine's ear, how her hand squeezed his with white-knuckled pressure, the forced brightness of their smiles when other guests approached their table. Charles excused himself from Sir David and began making his way back to Camilla, knowing he could no longer avoid the confrontation developing around Diana's necklace. The evening's charity objectives seemed secondary now to managing family relationships that threatened to fracture under public scrutiny. Every step brought him closer to conversations he wasn't prepared to have, questions he couldn't easily answer, and choices that would affect royal relationships for years to come. The orchestra began playing more energetic music as dinner concluded, and the evening moved toward its formal program of speeches and presentations. But Charles knew that underneath the carefully orchestrated public event, private drama was building toward a crescendo that could reshape everything they thought they understood about respect, memory, and the complex negotiations required to blend families under the world's watchful eyes. Charles returned to find Camilla engaged in animated discussion with the French ambassador's wife about sustainable fashion initiatives. Her laughter sounded genuine, but Charles noticed how her free hand periodically touched the necklace, as if reassuring herself of its presence. The gesture struck him as oddly protective, suggesting deeper significance to her choice than simple evening or selection. Ah, Charles, we were just discussing how royal patronage might support ethical jewelry design, Camilla said as he reclaimed his seat. Her words carried subtle emphasis that made Charles wonder if this conversation topic was coincidental or carefully planned. Madame Du Bois was explaining how French artisans are reviving traditional pearl cultivation techniques that respect marine ecosystems. The French ambassador's wife nodded enthusiastically. The craftsmanship in historical pieces remains unmatched, non? Like the beautiful necklace you wear tonight. Such perfect pearls speak to generations of expertise. One can imagine the stories such pieces could tell, the occasions they have witnessed. Charles felt the conversation circling back toward dangerous territory. Madame Du Bois appeared genuinely interested in the jewelry's craftsmanship, but her comments about stories and occasions felt loaded with potential for uncomfortable revelations. He glanced around the ballroom, noting increased attention focused on their table as the evening progressed, and guests relaxed into more personal conversations. Historical jewelry certainly carries emotional weight beyond its material value, Charles said carefully. The pieces become connected to specific memories, making their significance quite personal to the families involved. He watched Camilla's reaction closely, searching for signs of understanding about the implications of wearing Diana's necklace without family consultation. Camilla's smile remained steady, but Charles caught a flash of something sharper in her eyes. Sometimes pieces deserve to see the light again rather than remaining locked away, she replied. Beautiful things should be appreciated, don't you think? They honor their creators and their original owners through continued use rather than storage. The words hit Charles like a diplomatic slap. Camilla understood exactly what she was wearing and had made a conscious decision not just to wear Diana's necklace, but to justify that choice publicly. This wasn't an innocent mistake or oversight. It was a deliberate statement about her role in the royal family and her relationship to Diana's legacy. Before Charles could respond, commotion at William and Catherine's table drew his attention. The young couple was rising from their seats, with Catherine's diplomatic smile strained to its breaking point. William's military bearing had shifted into something more aggressive, his shoulders squared, as if preparing for battle rather than royal socializing. "Papa!" William's voice carried across the ballroom as he approached their table, using the childhood name that suggested emotional intensity beneath his formal demeanor. "Might we have a brief word? Catherine, and I hope to discuss the children's hospital presentation with you before the speeches begin." Charles recognized the request as diplomatic fiction. William's expression made clear that children's hospitals were far from his mind. Catherine stood slightly behind her husband, her composure intact but her knuckles white where she gripped her evening clutch. Both appeared ready for a confrontation that could not happen in public view. "Of course," Charles replied, rising smoothly. "Shall we step into the music room? It should be quieter there." He turned to Camilla with practiced royal courtesy. "My dear, would you mind entertaining our guests while we discuss the presentation details?" Camilla's nod appeared gracious, but Charles noticed tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there earlier. She understood that this private meeting would center on her jewelry choice, and her expression suggested she was prepared for whatever conversation would follow. The pearls at her throat caught the light as she turned back to Madame Du Bois, creating an elegant tableau that disguised the emotional storm brewing beneath the surface. The music room provided blessed privacy after the ballroom's public intensity. William closed the door with careful control, but his restraint felt fragile. Catherine moved to the window, staring out at the palace gardens while maintaining careful distance from both men. The silence stretched uncomfortably before William finally spoke. "That's Mama's necklace." His voice carried decades of suppressed emotion. The formal mother, replaced by the childhood term that revealed his vulnerable core. "The pearls she wore to my christening, to state dinners, to—" He stopped, struggling with memories that the necklace had apparently triggered with devastating clarity. Charles felt caught between competing loyalties, protective instincts, and diplomatic necessities. His son's pain was evident, but Camilla was his wife, deserving support even when her choices created impossible situations. The necklace had become a symbol of larger issues about respect, consultation, and the delicate balance required to honor Diana's memory while building new family relationships. "I noticed," Charles said quietly. "I was surprised by the choice." Catherine turned from the window, her usual grace replaced by barely controlled intensity. "Surprised?" Her voice carried disbelief that cut through royal politeness like a blade. "Charles, that necklace was meant for me. Diana wore it to every major event in William's childhood. It should have passed to William's wife, not—" She stopped herself before saying something irreversible, but the implication hung in the air between them. William stepped closer to his father, his height advantage creating an unconscious power dynamic that felt threatening despite their family relationship. "Did you know she was going to wear it tonight? Did you approve this?" The questions hit Charles like accusations, forcing him to confront his own confusion about Camilla's motivations. He had not known about the necklace choice, had not been consulted about accessing Diana's jewelry, and was struggling to understand whether this represented innocent selection or calculated provocation. His silence stretched long enough to provide its own answer. "You didn't know," Catherine said, reading his expression with the intuition that had made her successful in royal life. She chose Diana's most recognizable necklace, wore it to a public event, and didn't tell you beforehand. The implications settled over them like an uncomfortable blanket, suggesting either profound thoughtlessness or deliberate manipulation. Charles found himself defending his wife while privately questioning her choices. Camilla has access to the royal collection. Perhaps she simply chose a beautiful piece without considering all the implications. But even as he spoke, he remembered her earlier comment about pieces deserving to see light rather than remaining in storage, suggesting this was no innocent selection. "Papa, that necklace represents my childhood memories of Mama," William said, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. Seeing it on Camilla's throat tonight brought back every photograph, every state dinner, every moment when Mama wore those pearls while building the monarchy that Catherine and I will inherit. How are we supposed to react to that? The question exposed the central tension in blended royal families. How to honor the past while building new relationships. How to respect previous marriages while embracing current ones. How to balance children's emotional needs against adult romantic choices. Charles had navigated these waters for years, but Diana's jewelry represented particularly treacherous territory. Catherine approached them both, her diplomatic training evident in her careful word choice. "Charles, I love Diana like a sister-in-law, respected her completely, and have tried to honor her memory in my own royal service. But seeing her most personal jewelry worn by someone else, without any family discussion, feels like a violation of something sacred." The words stung because they rang true. Diana's necklace carried emotional weight that transcended monetary value or fashion choice. It represented memories, motherhood, and the complex legacy that Diana had left for her sons and their families. Camilla's decision to wear it publicly without consultation suggested either remarkable insensitivity or calculated boundary testing. Charles looked between his son and daughter-in-law, seeing their pain and confusion reflected in expressions that remained diplomatically controlled despite their emotional turmoil. William's military posture couldn't disguise the hurt child within, while Catherine's royal training barely contained her sense of violated boundaries and respect. "What would you like me to do?" Charles asked, genuinely uncertain how to navigate between his wife's autonomy and his family's emotional needs. The question revealed his own vulnerability, the impossibility of perfect solutions when personal relationships intersected with royal obligations under public scrutiny. William and Catherine exchanged glances, communicating in the wordless language that long marriage created. When Catherine nodded slightly, William turned back to his father with resolution that suggested they had anticipated this conversation and prepared their response. "We want the necklace returned to Diana's collection after tonight," William said firmly. "And we want consultation before any of Mama's personal jewelry appears in public again. Some things are too important for unilateral decisions. Papa, some boundaries need to be respected, even within families." The request felt reasonable, but Charles knew it would create its own complications with Camilla. Asking her to remove Diana's necklace would acknowledge that wearing it had been inappropriate, potentially humiliating her publicly while validating William and Catherine's position. The evening stretched ahead with speeches to make and guests to entertain, but this conversation had shifted the emotional landscape in ways that would affect their family relationships for months or years to come. Charles returned to the ballroom, carrying the weight of promises he wasn't sure he could keep. William and Catherine had agreed to maintain public composure for the remainder of the evening, but their ultimatum about Diana's necklace created a deadline that stretched only until tomorrow morning. The charity presentations would begin soon, requiring speeches from both Charles and William that somehow had to appear natural despite the family tension crackling beneath the surface. Camilla looked up as Charles reclaimed his seat, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes searching his face for clues about the private conversation. She had continued chatting with Madame Du Bois about sustainable fashion, but Charles noted how her hand rested protectively over the necklace, suggesting awareness that her jewelry choice had become the evening's central controversy. "Everything well with the presentation plans?" Camilla asked lightly, but her tone carried undercurrents of challenge and defiance. She knew exactly what the family meeting had addressed, and her question dared Charles to confront her directly about choices she clearly felt justified in making. "We discussed several details that need attention," Charles replied diplomatically, using the ambiguous language that royal life demanded when personal conflicts threatened public events. "The evening's objectives remain our priority, of course." But his eyes lingered on the pearls at her throat, and Camilla clearly understood the subtext of his carefully chosen words. The master of ceremonies approached their table to signal the beginning of formal presentations. Charles would speak first about the foundation's achievements, followed by William's remarks about future initiatives and Catherine's introduction of the evening's honored guests. The choreography required seamless cooperation between family members who were currently navigating emotional minefields disguised as jewelry choices. Charles rose to make his speech, grateful for the familiar structure of prepared remarks that would carry him through the next several minutes without requiring spontaneous diplomacy. The ballroom quieted as he approached the podium, hundreds of faces turning toward him with expectant attention. But his peripheral vision remained fixed on Camilla, beautiful and composed in her royal blue gown, Diana's necklace catching the spotlight like captured stars. "Good evening, and welcome to this celebration of generosity and hope," Charles began, his voice carrying the authority developed through decades of public speaking. "Tonight we gather not just as supporters of children's health care, but as a community committed to ensuring that every child receives the medical attention they deserve, regardless of circumstance." The words flowed automatically while Charles's mind raced through calculations about family relationships, public perception, and the impossible mathematics of blending past and present in royal life. He spoke about hospital equipment purchases, research funding, and treatment innovations while wondering how to address Camilla's jewelry choice without creating public scandal or private humiliation. "The Princess of Wales has been instrumental in developing our mental health initiatives for young patients," Charles continued, nodding toward Catherine with genuine warmth despite their recent confrontation. Her insights into childhood emotional needs have transformed how we approach comprehensive care. Catherine smiled and nodded acknowledgement, appearing completely supportive despite the tension surrounding Diana's necklace. The speech concluded to enthusiastic applause, providing Charles a moment to study the ballroom's atmosphere as he returned to his seat. Most guests seemed genuinely engaged with the charity focus, but he noticed subtle clusters of conversation that suggested some recognition of a necklace and speculation about its significance. Royal watchers among the attendees were beginning to piece together the story behind Camilla's jewelry choice. William's speech followed seamlessly, his military bearing lending authority to discussions of international healthcare partnerships and technological innovations in children's treatment. But Charles detected slight strain in his son's voice when William mentioned honoring the legacy of previous royal healthcare advocates, without specifically naming Diana, though everyone understood the reference. My mother's commitment to children's welfare established foundations that continue guiding our work today, William said, his eyes moving deliberately toward Camilla's table. We carry forward her values while building new initiatives for future generations. The words sounded diplomatic, but Charles recognized the subtle challenge in their delivery. William was claiming Diana's legacy while questioning whether Camilla understood her responsibilities as its guardian. Catherine's portion of the presentations focused on specific hospital achievements and introduced several young patients who had benefited from foundation funding. Her natural warmth and genuine engagement with the children created emotional high points that reminded everyone why these events mattered beyond their social and political implications. But Charles noticed how carefully she avoided looking directly at Camilla during her remarks, suggesting unresolved feelings about the necklace controversy. As the formal presentations concluded and the evening shifted toward dancing and informal socializing, Charles found himself strategically positioned between competing family obligations. Camilla expected his support in whatever statement she was making through her jewelry choice. William and Catherine expected him to address what they considered a violation of Diana's memory. The hundreds of guests expected seamless royal entertainment while remaining unaware of the emotional drama playing out among their hosts. "Shall we dance?" Camilla asked as the orchestra began playing a waltz, extending her hand with the gracious smile that had charmed the British public over the years. The invitation represented more than social courtesy. It was a request for public support, a demonstration of unity that would signal Charles's position in the necklace controversy. Charles took her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of their partnership while grappling with unfamiliar doubts about her judgment and sensitivity. As they moved onto the dance floor, other couples joined them in the traditional opening waltz that marked these events' transition from formal program to social celebration. But Charles felt the weight of observation from William and Catherine's table, where the young couple watched their every movement with careful attention. "You're troubled," Camilla murmured as they turned together, her voice low enough that no observers could overhear. The conversation with William didn't go well. It wasn't a question. She had read his expression accurately and understood that the family meeting had created new complications rather than resolving existing tensions. "The necklace has significance I'm not sure you fully considered," Charles replied carefully, keeping his tone neutral while they continued their elegant rotation around the dance floor. Diana's jewelry carries emotional weight that affects William and Catherine in ways that might not have been apparent when you made tonight's choice. Camilla's hand tightened slightly on his shoulder, the only sign of tension in her otherwise perfect dancing posture. "I considered everything, Charles. Perhaps it's time for this family to consider whether Diana's memory should continue dictating present choices. That necklace is beautiful. I have access to it, and tonight seemed appropriate for something special." The words hit Charles like cold water, revealing the calculation behind what he had hoped was innocent selection. Camilla had deliberately chosen Diana's most recognizable necklace as a statement about her own position in the royal family and her relationship to Diana's continuing influence over family decisions. This wasn't oversight or insensitivity. It was a carefully planned assertion of authority and autonomy. William feels that certain pieces should have been consulted about, Charles said, attempting diplomacy while the music swirled around them, and other dancers created elegant patterns across the marble floor. Some jewelry carries particular significance for the children involved. William is 37 years old, Camilla replied firmly, her voice carrying steel beneath its cultured tone. Perhaps it's time he stopped treating his mother's possessions as shrine objects and accepted that life moves forward. I'm your wife, Charles. I have been for nearly 2 decades. Some acknowledgement of that reality might be appropriate. The conversation was developing into territory Charles had never wanted to navigate. Direct confrontation between his wife and children over Diana's legacy and its place in their current family structure. Every word carried implications that would affect relationships for years to come. But the dance floor provided no privacy for the serious discussion these issues demanded. We should talk about this privately, Charles suggested, aware that their conversation was probably being observed and potentially overheard by other dancers and ballroom staff. Tonight's focus should remain on the charity objectives we're here to support. But even as he spoke, Charles realized that the necklace controversy had already overshadowed the evening's charitable purposes. Tomorrow's newspaper coverage would likely focus more on Camilla's jewelry choice than on the millions raised for children's hospitals, transforming a successful fundraising event into another chapter in the ongoing saga of royal family dynamics and Diana's persistent influence over their relationships. The waltz concluded, and Charles escorted Camilla back to their table, while calculating how to navigate the remaining hours of public socializing without further inflaming family tensions. But he could feel William's eyes following their movement across the ballroom, and he knew that this conversation was far from finished despite the evening's social demands and diplomatic requirements. The evening's final hours stretched before them like a diplomatic minefield disguised as social celebration. Charles worked the room with practiced ease, discussing trade relationships with Commonwealth representatives while his mind churned through family crisis management strategies. Every conversation felt surreal against the backdrop of Diana's necklace catching ballroom lights and the careful distance William and Catherine maintained from Camilla's orbit. Your Majesty, might I photograph you and the Queen Consort for tomorrow's charity coverage? Asked the official palace photographer, approaching with equipment that would document this evening for historical record. The request seemed routine, but Charles realized that any photographs of Camilla wearing Diana's necklace would become permanent documentation of tonight's controversy, preserved in royal archives and newspaper files for future generations to analyze. Of course, Charles replied automatically, though every instinct warned against creating visual evidence of the evening's jewelry choice. But refusing the photographer would draw more attention than cooperating, and royal life demanded maintaining appearances even during personal crisis. He guided Camilla toward the ballroom's ornate fireplace, where portraits had been taken for decades of royal family members attending state functions. As the photographer arranged lighting and adjusted angles, Charles caught sight of William and Catherine near the ballroom's entrance, preparing to make their departure. Protocol demanded they bid farewell to the evening's hosts, but their approach felt more like a final confrontation than social courtesy. Catherine had retrieved her wrap, and William's posture suggested military discipline barely containing civilian emotion. "Papa, thank you for a memorable evening," William said as they reached the fireplace area, his words carrying multiple meanings that only family members would fully understand. His eyes moved deliberately to Diana's necklace before meeting Charles's gaze with unmistakable intensity. "Catherine and I look forward to continuing our conversation about family traditions and their appropriate honoring." Catherine stepped forward with diplomatic grace that masked the steel in her voice. "Thank you for including us in such an important charitable event," she said to Camilla directly. "The necklace you've chosen is quite striking. I'm sure it holds special significance." The comment sounded pleasant to observers, but carried clear challenge for those who understood the jewelry's history and the evening's emotional undercurrents. Camilla's smile remained steady, but Charles noticed her hand moving protectively to the pearls once again. "Thank you, Catherine. Sometimes meaningful pieces deserve to be seen and appreciated rather than kept hidden away. I thought tonight's celebration of children's welfare made it particularly appropriate." The words sounded gracious, but contained subtle defiance that suggested this conversation would continue long after tonight's guest departed. The photographer waited patiently while family tensions played out in diplomatic language, professional enough to recognize significant moments, but trained to remain invisible during royal interactions. Charles realized that whatever photographs emerged from tonight would capture not just clothing and jewelry, but the complex emotional dynamics that define blended family relationships under public scrutiny. "Smile, please," the photographer requested, and all four adults arranged their features into expressions of family harmony while private storms raged beneath the surface. The camera flashed several times, capturing images that would appear in tomorrow's newspapers alongside articles about charitable fundraising success and renewed speculation about royal family relationships. William and Catherine completed their farewells with appropriate warmth, kissing both Charles and Camilla before moving toward the ballroom exit. But their departure felt more like strategic withdrawal than social conclusion, suggesting that tonight's conflicts would resume tomorrow in private settings where diplomatic language could give way to honest emotional expression. "Lovely young people," commented the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had observed the farewell exchange with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading subtext in official interactions. "The Prince of Wales carries his mother's legacy beautifully, doesn't he? And the princess has such natural grace with commemorating family history." The comment felt loaded with meaning that Charles couldn't quite decipher. Did the Archbishop recognize Diana's necklace? Was he offering subtle commentary on appropriate ways to honor deceased family members? Or was this innocent observation that coincidentally touched on the evening's central controversy? Charles nodded politely while wondering how many other guests had connected various conversational threads to understand tonight's underlying drama. As the evening wound toward its conclusion, Charles found himself calculating tomorrow's challenges while maintaining tonight's social obligations. The charity gala had achieved its fundraising goals, raising nearly £3 million for children's hospitals across the Commonwealth. But the personal costs were still being tallied, with family relationships strained by questions of respect, consultation, and appropriate boundaries around Diana's continuing influence over their lives. The last guest departed near midnight, leaving Charles and Camilla alone in the ornate ballroom, where staff efficiently cleared tables and restored furniture to its usual configuration. The evening's elegant decorations looked somehow defeated in the harsh working lights that replaced romantic chandeliers, and Charles felt exhausted by hours of diplomatic conversation layered over emotional crisis management. "Well, that was successful," Camilla said, removing her earrings while the pearls remained around her throat like a statement she wasn't ready to retract. The charity objectives were certainly met, and everyone seemed to enjoy themselves. Her tone suggested satisfaction with the evening's outcomes, but Charles detected underlying tension that matched his own complicated feelings about the night's events. William and Catherine were upset about the necklace choice. Charles said directly, abandoning diplomatic language now that privacy allowed honest conversation. They felt it should have been discussed with family before appearing publicly. There are sensitivities around Diana's jewelry that perhaps weren't fully considered. Camilla turned to face him fully, her expression hardening into something Charles rarely saw from his wife. "Charles, I have been your wife for 18 years. I have endured constant comparison to your first wife, accepted that my children would never have equal status with hers, and watched every choice I make analyzed through the lens of Diana's preferences and legacy. Tonight, I wore a beautiful necklace from the royal collection to support children's charity. If William and Catherine cannot accept my right to royal jewelry after nearly 2 decades of marriage, then perhaps they need to examine their own attitudes rather than questioning mine. The words carried decades of accumulated frustration and highlighted tensions Charles had hoped time would resolve. Camilla's position contained undeniable logic. She was indeed his wife, entitled to royal collection access, and tired of living in Diana's shadow. But William's position also resonated with emotional truth. Some possessions carried significance beyond ownership rights, requiring sensitivity that transcended legal entitlements. The necklace has particular significance for William, Charles said carefully. It represents childhood memories, maternal connections, and legacy issues that make it different from other collection pieces. Perhaps those considerations might have influenced tonight's choice if they had been discussed beforehand. Or perhaps William needs to accept that his mother died 26 years ago and that honoring her memory doesn't require freezing her possessions in perpetual shrine status, Camilla replied sharply. I respected Diana, Charles, but I will not spend the rest of my life tiptoeing around the sensitivities of grown men who cannot accept that their father remarried. The conversation revealed fundamental disagreements about family dynamics, respect, and the appropriate management of Diana's continuing influence over their relationships. Charles found himself caught between competing loyalties and valid emotional needs, with no clear path toward resolution that wouldn't require someone to compromise deeply held positions about identity, respect, and family boundaries. "What would you like me to do?" Charles asked, echoing his earlier question to William, but directed now toward Camilla with equal uncertainty about available options. The necklace hung between them like crystallized conflict, beautiful and destructive simultaneously, representing issues that transcended jewelry to encompass fundamental questions about blended family relationships and royal obligations. Camilla reached up to unclasp the necklace, the pearls sliding through her fingers like liquid starlight as they pooled in her palm. "I'll return it to the collection tomorrow," she said quietly. "But understand, Charles, that this retreat comes from love for you, not from acceptance of William's authority over my choices. Some boundaries need to be established about whose opinions matter in our marriage, and tonight has clarified several things for me about family dynamics I thought we had resolved." The words carried finality that suggested tonight's necklace controversy had catalyzed larger conversations about authority, respect, and family hierarchy that would continue long after Diana's pearls returned to their storage case. Charles accepted the necklace from Camilla's hands, feeling its surprising weight, and remembering the last time he had seen Diana fasten these same pearls around her neck before a state dinner that now seemed impossibly distant. As they left the ballroom together, Charles understood that tonight had changed something fundamental in their family relationships. The necklace would return to the royal collection, but the questions it had raised about respect, consultation, and appropriate boundaries would require ongoing attention. Diana's legacy would continue influencing their lives, but perhaps with new awareness of its emotional complexity and the careful balance required to honor the past while building sustainable relationships for the future. Tomorrow would bring private conversations, diplomatic solutions, and careful management of public perceptions about royal family harmony. But tonight had established that some issues required ongoing attention rather than permanent resolution, and that blended families, even royal ones, required constant negotiation about respect, boundaries, and the delicate balance between honoring the past and embracing the present.